Welcome to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show, issue number 36. Roy, it's the Halloween special. And look who we have over here.
Do you feel in charge?
Hey everyone, welcome to Pop XP. And before the show starts, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome new content. And don't forget, if you can, make sure to share our stream on all your social media outlets. We appreciate it, and thanks for helping us grow the Pop XP channel.
Ooh, look at it's bad. This is the Halloween special of the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show. We got the monster of Marvel madness, the king here, Roy Thomas in the house. We got Bane, and down below we got the Pop XP, and with Niall and Billy Tucci in spirit. What's going on, Hulk? What's going on?
Oh, you know what's going on. Make sure to subscribe and smash that bell to get notifications. Yeah.
I'm Cimino the Cimmerian, and we got Mr. Roy Thomas as...
Well, I'm wearing my shirt. Anybody recognize the... This is the little animation sequence from Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein at the beginning of the show. My wife, Dan, got me this a few months ago for a surprise gift. This is the closest thing I get to a Christmas present, you know.
And you guys know that this innocent man right here, who's so well spoken, has ushered in all the horror at Marvel. That's what we're going to talk about today. Our favorite characters, the Marvel monsters, the how you bypassed the code of what is it, the code of authority?
The comics code.
Oh my God, Roy bypassed this.
I don't know. Did we bypass it?
Did you bribe him?
Oh, we'll talk. What do you think, Bane? What do you think?
I think, yeah, it was about time. It was about time for the code to be massaged a little bit, and so that, you know, I know they couldn't say zombies yet, but you know, especially in the comics. But yeah, there's a lot of great horror characters that we're going to talk about today. Yeah, we're going to really get into the meat and bones today.
And just so you know, I'm Cimino the Sumerian. Check that out. Robert E. Howard in spirit right here. What do you think, Roy? What do you think of the hat?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think that you looked better when you were alive.
Okay, so we're here because we love Halloween and it's special. So Roy, why don't you start it off for us in talking about first? It started with, I think, who was the first vampire? Who was some of the first monsters that started?
Of course, Marvel or Timely or Atlas or whatever the name of the company was that week back in the 50s. It had a lot of, you know, monster stories, you know, the EC and Adventures into the Unknown vein, but they didn't really have, I don't think, any continuing characters. The closest thing was the Venus comic, which was kind of a horror comic in its last year or so under Bill Everett's artwork, but they never really went in for any monster heroes. But somehow or other, you know, while DC with its House of Mystery would have all the short story kind of stuff, the, you know, a la EC and so forth, we were so oriented more toward heroes. So while we ended up having some of those anthology books, Stan was more interested in getting heroic characters. So the first thing that happened was that the comics code in about the turn of 1971, there was the pressure to kind of update it a little bit. So they rewrote it. And of course, everybody knows, if they're, you know, literate in these subjects, that since the turn of 1955, you hadn't been able to have a werewolf in comics. You hadn't been able to have a vampire. You hadn't been able to have you could have a ghoul, whatever that was supposed to be, but you couldn't have the Walking Dead. As Denny O'Neil once said, they couldn't walk around, but if they sat down, you could eat them. I think that was the way he would play. But anyway, so in 71, they suddenly allowed this. And right away, it just so happened by a weird coincidence, total coincidence, Stan decided he's taking 4 months off from writing Amazing Spider-Man because he was going to write a movie script with Alain Resnais, the French New Wave director, of Last Year at Marienbad and Hiroshima Mon Amour and so forth. So he decided, I'm going to write Spider-Man. I wanted to write Fantastic Four. I had no interest in writing Spider-Man. But if Stan says I write Spider-Man, then Archie Goodwin got the shot at being the second guy to ever write FF. So I did. And but Stan also had an assignment for me for the 2-part story, which was going to be, he wanted me, working with artist Gil Kane, to come up with make the first like a vampire villain for Spider-Man to fight. Gil and I had talked it over briefly. We were just going to bring in Dracula. Remember, Dracula was obviously not a Marvel character at this time. We were just going to bring in Dracula. Or we could have brought in somebody who was obviously like Dracula, but give him a different name. Maybe Nosferatu, But Stan said, no. So he's a co-creator of that character. He says, no, I want a supervillain vampire. I want a guy who looks like a supervillain. And so Gil and I went off, and that's when we made up Morbius. So Stan is in a sense a co-creator of Morbius too, because and then Gil and I designed his character. He's still in your basic red and blue. But Gil gave him this great face with a little, it's not a goatee. I don't know what kind of beard they call that, and so forth. That's not a great cover I don't think, for a vampire book. He's slapping him, it doesn't really, but at least we have the word vampire on the, in the logo, in the balloon, and he looks like a vampire. So I guess it's okay. And of course, Spider-Man was then briefly in his 6 arm period. So by sheer coincidence, I ended up being the first person to write a new vampire story, for Marvel, except of course the funny thing is where the code was changed, they were supposed to be werewolves and vampires in the classic tradition of books that are taught in schools or something. It was actually worded in that case if you read it. And of course, Morbius is not a vampire in that tradition. He's not a vampire like Dracula. He's just a guy with a blood disease, because I swiped the idea from I think it was 1957 black and white movie called The Vampire, which was about a guy who became sort of vampire-like, going around killing people and drinking their blood because of a blood disease. And, so I just swiped that idea and then made it into to Morbius. And I guess the name Morbius, I could say maybe it came subconsciously from the character that Walter Pidgeon played in Forbidden Planet. But I wasn't aware of that. I was thinking of Sarcophagus Macabre. Sarcophagus Macabre from Pogo. That's the vulture.
Oh,
and I was looking for a name like Sarcophagus Macabre, and you start saying macabre.
From the
And then from Macabre, I thought of morbid, and I came up with Morbius. But that doesn't mean somewhere in the back of my mind it could have been the.
Wow, you never told me that. Wow,
well, I don't tell you everything.
Not well. What about this? But even prior to that, you did a little a ditty with a Frankenstein's monster, and you put that in the X-Men, did you not? That was even prior to.
Oh yeah, it was the true story of Frankenstein, who was a Frankenstein monster who turned out to be a robot. Yeah, well, there had been a Batman story when I was a kid called The True Story of Frankenstein, where Professor Nichols sent Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson, back into time. They went back to the time they met Mary Shelley and some big guy named Igor, who became the model of the Frankenstein monster. And I like that idea of telling that having some true story behind something. I know they kind of retconned it out, so now that was not the real Frankenstein monster. But at that time, of course, it was meant to be when Don Heck and I did it.
Oh, wow.
It was just a fun story. A little, if this was in the article, it's a little inspired by The Thing from Another World, too, which was like Frankenstein, comes from Mars type of thing.
Wow. Go ahead, Steve.
Well,
Bane.
It's funny you should mention the Frankenstein, because I think one of the most sought after issues of the Invaders is that Nazi Frankenstein character that you have. I tell you, people eat that up every
really?
second.
Heil Frankenstein?
Yes.
Well, I have to tell you, that is entirely Don Glut. I was kind of distracted in those years. That's the first year or so after I moved there. Within about a year, I met Dan and started dating her. And before that, I was going around, trying to meet girls. I was, trying to have a good time, a different life than I'd lived in New York. I was coming out of a, separation. With the divorce was in the works and things like this. So, and the last thing in the world I really care, and I'd left the editor-in-chief job a couple of years before. And the last thing in the world I really cared about, really was sitting down and writing comics most of the time, even though I liked them when I did them and I liked doing them. But the bloom was off the rose after 10 or 12 years. And after leaving the editor-in-chief job, I didn't read them as much. I had a minimal contact with Marvel, and so forth. And and Don Glut was going through kind of a dry period. He'd become a good friend of mine. And so I said, he'd written a number of comics. Dr. Spectre, he made up as a continuing character for Gold Key and things like that. So I had him, I said, once you write a story, it was inevitable. If you have Don Glut write a story for you, one of the first things he's going to do is throw in dinosaurs. And one of the other first things he's going to do is throw in the Frankenstein monster. Those are two things you bet on. And that was fine with me. So we did it.
Yeah.
But it's all him. I have nothing to do with that story except, editing and approving it.
Sure.
Go ahead, Steve.
It's funny, obviously Morbius is it's like a beginning of a whole new era, for the Spider-Man villains. It's something different. And again, this is what separated Marvel from the rest. It wasn't just a regular vampire. This is a vampire created by science, and the fact that he was a scientist that wore that outlandish costume just made it even more magnificent for people like me, and of course your creation leads to Mr. Steve Gerber taking that character and doing some of the wildest things I've ever seen in the Fear magazine. And again, you had that beautiful 1970s feel where you had a vampire that was scientific in nature, off in a parallel dimension of space. It's only the 70s, Roy. It's only the 70s. You can't do that anymore. So I want to thank you for that one anyway.
Well, I can't do a lot of stuff I used to be able to do in the 70s. So.
And then one of the next creatures to come in was a guy that fought the Hulk in a big shambly looking thing that I think it was that you had the Glob.
The
Glob come in there. Tell me what's up with that.
I'm kind of proud of the Glob because while Stan and Jack had done a couple of their monster stories that had a little touch of this, but this was the first thing in the Marvel superhero books. This was the first of many, many, many emendations of the Heap in a Silver or Bronze Age comic book. I was a big fan of the Heap when I was a kid. By this time, I had found out about Theodore Sturgeon's story, It, that probably inspired the Heap, and I'd read that, and so I liked that a lot. So I decided I would just totally swipe the Heap. And I had a great name for him, which had the word heap in it, which is part of the thing. It was called The Shape, but Stan decided that The Shape was feminine. I said, well, men have a shape too, but says, no, shape sounds feminine. He's probably right. What's funny is I had also used the same shape for a Charlton character that I kind of ghosted. But anyway, so he decided to call it the Glob, which was a name he had previously used in one of the, the Kirby stories and so forth. And that was fine with me. It was a good name. I didn't, it wasn't that original. I would have preferred mine, but Glob was a good name. So I did one or two stories of that character. And the thing I guess I'm proudest of is it predates Man-Thing. It predates Swamp Thing, either version, or anything like that. So it was the first of those characters to come into the superhero world. And I was kind of pleased with it. And then yet somehow, although he's read that story, he had to approve the cover and everything else. By the way, Len Wein read the Hulk. I think maybe he saw the Glob before he made up Man-Thing, Swamp Thing. But Stan decided one day, calls me in his office and says that for this black and white we were going to do, Savage Tales, at the turn of 71, he says, we're going to do a character called the Man-Thing. And I didn't care much for that idea because we had a thing. We don't need a Man-Thing if we got a thing. It just seemed like duplicatory to me. But again, Stan was Stan. Stan was aware of the thing. And if he wanted a Man-Thing too, he got a giant-sized Man-Thing, right? And so we kicked around ideas. I don't remember what the others were, 4 or 5 different versions. We finally came up with 2 or 3 sentences the guy, falls into a swamp and he mixes with these chemicals and that kind of thing. And then I went off and wrote the synopsis for it. But, I never liked writing those characters. Even Morbius didn't interest me that much. I didn't like writing horror characters. I didn't mind making them up, but I didn't really want to write them myself. So Jerry Conway just inherited everything. I do something and I just ladder it off to Jerry, and he'd do a great job with it. Whether it's Werewolf, or Man Thing, and a couple of others and so forth. And I was quite content that way. I made up the characters and so forth. And that's all I cared about.
And soon after that, though, you're starting to. When was the usher of the Marvel monsters? It probably started with Tomb of Dracula because it had to come soon at that time. So what's the whole story with that?
We got 4 black and white horror or monster, we wouldn't call them horror, magazines in 2 days. I had just become editor-in-chief, which meant that I was Stan's flunky on a slightly higher level, and, which was fine with me. I had no desire or ambition to ever be anything more. And we had a good relationship. So one day he comes in, he says, we already had actually, there was going to be a black and white Dracula book. Evidently, I read this things that I wrote, because I don't have conscious memory of it, but evidently there was going to be a black and white Dracula magazine around the time of Savage Tales, and Stan decided to do Savage Tales instead. So, but a little later he decided there's going to be a Dracula, and I think it started off to be a black and white magazine. I think that's why Gene Colan wanted to ink it himself and all that. And so it got turned into a color comic because there was just more of a market. But, a few months later, when he had a chance, and once he was once he was publisher, he tells me, we're going to do another book. It's called Dracula Lives, which is a phrase that's on the cover of Tomb of Dracula #1. And he says, it's going to be about Dracula. He's going to be, and you're going to have him in all kinds of different periods. You're going to have 2 or 3 stories, present and the past. I didn't think about the fact that Dracula's never supposed to have left Transylvania, until he came to England, right, in the late 19th century. So somehow having him wander around the world was a violation of Bram Stoker in a way, but we made it work, I guess. So that's fine. So we got a book. It's mostly comics. There's a little bit of reprint in it. We had some text pieces. All that stuff kept the cost down, because you could print the old comics for free, and the text articles with a little illustration didn't cost as much as pages of comic art. So the next day, Stan calls me and says, I've been thinking. He says, there's a lot of vampires that aren't Dracula. Can't argue with that logic. He says, so I want to do another book called Vampire Tales, which doesn't have Dracula. It's got all kinds of other vampires. It could have Morbius, it could have new other characters, whatever. So I said, okay, but he's not done. He says, but it also occurred to me, Stan was brilliant. He could figure these things out. He says, there's a lot of monsters that aren't vampires. Yeah. So we're going to have another book called Monsters Unleashed. That can have anything in it. So okay, now in 24 hours, we've got 3 new books of 50, 60 interior pages, even if some are reprint or text, big sudden addition to what we're doing. We're having that's 100 something pages, 150 pages added to the schedule. So then the next day comes. We're now talking period, 48 hours after the announcement about Dracula is. He calls me and says, I just had another idea. I'm wondering, what can he still do? He's handled all the monsters. He says, I want a particular thing. I said, I want to do a book called Tales of the Zombie. I said, what zombie? He says, well, that's your job, And he says, just make up a character as the zombie. I said, well, actually, you made him up. He says, what do you mean? He says, well, I says, you and Bill Everett did a wonderful story back in Menace. I don't know if I remembered the name of the book then, but I knew I'd read that story. I'd seen the black and white proofs of it. I hadn't seen it until we discovered the black and white proofs, I guess, in some warehouse or something. And so now we could print it. And I said, the story was okay, but the version by Bill Everett of that monster, this kind of Frankensteinian look and the grimness of it was just so fantastic. So I'm going to take that story and make that the core of the entire book. And so I worked with Steve Gerber on the plot. And so next we have the zombie. So in 48 hours, we had 4 new 68-page books on top of everything else. I mean, how in the world we were going to turn all this out? Stan never worried. We were obviously going to suddenly have to, hire a bunch of new people as freelancers and things. But, well, I had to do something to earn that raise that I didn't get yet.
That the zombie though, like he had that long hair. Did
Yeah,
originally?
they lengthened the hair of the Bill Everett version when they printed that story. I was kind of sorry to see it in a way, but it made sense. We had to they lengthened his hair. It looks a little like Cimino the Barbarian, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, that
But they did that little bit, and then John Buscema did the thing around it. John wasn't really a horror artist. They might have been better off, getting more of a horror artist. But of course, he was such a good artist, so he was a logical choice.
Oh, go ahead, Steve.
It's definitely a fascinating time. Obviously, the new format allows for certain things you can get away with. Pretty soon, you also had Deadly Ants of Kung Fu. You already had the Savage Tales, and soon you had Savage Sword of Conan. You had a lot of stuff going on. You had a lot under your plate. But I always remember in England, those magazines were non-existent. They were like holy grails that I heard about from across the ocean, and I was like, oh wow. So I would see pictures of them. So when I first came to the States, that was my main mission. I would go to convention after convention, and I would be picking up all of those horror, magazines, and they did really feature some beautiful covers.
Oh, crazy good.
Absolutely. And the funny thing is that in recent years, a lot of collectors, a lot of people are beginning to realize just how magnificent those magazines are, and are actually hunting them down. It's a wonderful thing. And one of my favorite covers of all the horror covers is actually, I think it's Dracula Lives number 13. It's the red cover where Dracula's coming down on that person sitting on the seat, and it's absolutely stunning. That's probably my second favorite. So yeah, those magazines, definitely very popular right now.
Would that be Louis Dominguez? He did a lot of those covers on Dracula.
That's a very good question. I don't know.
Yeah. I own the original of one of those covers at the very first Dracula Lives by Boris Vallejo.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And I also owned for several years the first zombie cover, which Boris was really angry about, because it's a beautiful cover. It has a very Frazetish feeling with the colors kind of gradually fading in the background. It has that really wonderful feel. But Stan didn't like the face that Boris had put on the woman in there. He thought, I don't know, I guess the real thing would be he felt she looked, I don't know, like she didn't look Caucasian enough. He wanted a Caucasian since she had a little more of a, I don't know, cast, something or other. I don't know exactly. But whatever it was, he just wanted a different kind of, woman, no more generic Caucasian woman, I guess. So Stan being Stan, it never occurred to him that a guy who had painted this picture might object to him having somebody else paint a face. I don't know who he did, but maybe it was Gray Morrow. Which is funny because he had somebody else paint something over one of Gray Morrow's pictures. I mean, Stan, we kept trying to. I didn't think of this either because I didn't have that background, but Jerry Conway in particular had come in from science fiction and so forth, and he would mention, that they just didn't do things like that in the science fiction, where it was a different thing than the usual comic art. And I was always trying to keep Stan from getting that done, because it made the artist just furious. It wasn't their artwork anymore. It had ruined their artwork, and they felt, they didn't have the resale value. Also, they wanted those paintings back, and that was a time when we were still in the early stages of the artwork. But so we had to kind of negotiate through that territory. Of course, I hung on to Boris for Conan paintings as long as I could, until he had priced himself out of our league after 5 or 6 covers. But we got all the covers out if we could before that. But we had Earl Norham doing some. He came over from the Men's Magazine's book, but he did some nice covers. That guy I mentioned did a bunch of Dracula covers. We had some good artists. Some of them were Spanish.
The issue 13, it could be Earl Norham. That issue.
Earl did a lot of covers for those books, Conan included.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead now.
Now, so you've had a lot of books that come with, vampires and things of that nature. We've had kind of a swamp type character come in. When did my favorite horror monster of all time is the wolf man, the werewolves. When did the wolves start coming into the pages?
Well, that's actually very soon after Dracula. As soon as Dracula, if I'm not mistaken, just a few months after Dracula. I think it was early 71 or something. But anyway, whatever it is, it was after Dracula, and after, of course, Morbius then, because Morbius came first. But Stan Stan didn't tell me to create a werewolf, but I just, I can see the way the thing is going. You got to, you got to fight a vampire. Somehow you're going to want a werewolf, maybe Frankenstein too pretty soon, but you're going to want a werewolf. So I had come up with this idea. I think I'd been kicking around for a while, independent of Marvel, but I couldn't do anything with it, which I called Werewolf. I Werewolf. It was mainly just because the werewolf was narrating it in first person, which is the reason for the title. And so I brought the thing into Stan, which is about a 2-sentence idea. Stan never wanted much more than that, and it's just basically it was like I was a teenage werewolf meets Spider-Man. Basically he was like Peter Parker as as I was a teenage werewolf. That's what it became. The only change that Stan made was that he said, no, I don't like that title, I Werewolf. He says, it's Werewolf by Night. I said, what? Werewolf by day wouldn't make much sense. I said, okay, if he wants Werewolf by Night. So we get, Werewolf by Night, Werewolf by afternoon. He has an afternoon shadow. I don't know. But anyway, but other than that, Stan left us totally alone. So I went out and my first wife, Jeannie, and I we're going to a car show in Midtown Manhattan at some big Coliseum type building, because a friend of hers was a model who, sat on the cars to look good and all that. So we went in and see her. Well, we had very little interest in cars. We don't own a car in Manhattan. So after 15 minutes, we left, and I'm just preoccupied. I have to plot this thing by tomorrow, the Werewolf by Night. So Jeannie and I sat around outside this building on some, little raised wall and plotted out the first story. I had a vague idea. She plotted out. So she's, basically becomes, in essence, like the co-creator, and, certainly co-plotted that first story. And, but again, I didn't want to write it, and Jeannie was an established writer at the time. So Jerry Conway, where are you? So he comes in, and of course, Mike Plug. I think maybe we might have given the plot to Plug before Jerry got it, because it was done, Marvel style. But and of course, Plug was a perfect, as Plug used to say, "You give me all the hairy creatures, you give me the man thing, you give me Frankenstein, you give me everything that's hairy." He says, I'm typecast, he said. But of course, he did a wonderful job. It's just a shame after a few issues he couldn't also ink it. It never looked quite as good when he didn't, ink it after the first few issues. But other than that, Plug was just such a perfect artist for that book. The funny thing is, Jerry gave him the name Jack Russell, and neither he nor I knew that was the name of a breed of dog, evidently. I thought maybe he did it as a little joke and just got it past me, but he says he didn't know it either because he knew nothing about dogs.
So
it's a happy coincidence.
Yeah.
Weird coincidence.
So speaking of Werewolf by Night, might as well go right into it. What about Werewolf by Night has already premiered this year in 2022, October 7th, the Halloween special. What did you think of that, Roy? Why don't you tell the people out there, what did you think of Werewolf by Night? Seeing your two, that also had the zombie in there, and
I guess that was a zombie.
Yeah, and your other co-creating man thing.
Yeah. I don't know. The man thing looked great in there. The werewolf too. I was a little thrown off at first because, of course, it's not an origin. I wanted to see the origin of the guy gets the bite, just like Lon Chaney Jr. did, or like in that earlier, was it Werewolf of London with Henry Hull? Yeah. I think he gets bitten by a werewolf on a mountain where he's climbing up to get an orchid or something. I wanted to see an origin, but what they were doing was like one of Jerry's third, fourth, fifth, eighth stories, where he'd have them meet all these strange cabals and secret organizations, and they were really very much in the spirit of what Jerry. You remember that's the series that introduced the Darkhold, and it had a bunch of secret societies and things, and so it was very much in the spirit of an early Jerry Conway story, and it was good. Once you got into it, it had the feel of an old kind of movie, and at the same time, there's a fair amount of violence. The surprise was, of course, finding out the monster they're hunting is spoiler alert. If you haven't seen it by this time, by the time this airs, you deserve what you get. But anyway, it turns out the monster they're hunting is this man thing, and he's a buddy of the werewolf, but like they've met before or something. So maybe there's a story they can do there. I just love the idea that you're already working toward Legion of Monsters by the time you get through the first 20 minutes of Werewolf, because unfortunately they won't be able to bring Morbius in, who was a member of that, because he's the Sony version, but but do something else. But it was really nice to see, and I hope that they, do another whole series about it. I was very nice to see Jeannie, Jerry, and Plug and me get a separate credit for for the Jack Russell werewolf. And I thought they'd use this new character. I think they've got a new guy who's become the werewolf, and I'm glad they used Jack Russell because that's the character that we all made up, and that made any money for Marvel was all made off Werewolf by Night, not off anything the new stuff.
I'm gonna throw it to Steve, but Steve, did you see it yet?
No.
Okay, Niall,
He was watching Bane for the 100th.
I saw it. Yeah.
What is your take on it?
I absolutely loved it. I loved how they kind of, did an homage to the classic horror films, the style of it. Even just if you looked in the effects, you had that the film flickers and the dust and stuff that would get caught when they were editing and things. They captured it, but it was fun. It was a fun, movie. I love Werewolf by Night. I thought it was great, and the fact that they had, the man thing in there, and they kept true to the characters' designs. They didn't make something really off and weird where you just got a slight resemblance of the original. If you look at an image from the comic and then you actually look at what they did in this little movie here, I think they did a phenomenal job with it. I wish it wasn't just a one shot,
Yeah.
but hey, I think it was great what they did. Hopefully they tailor something off of it.
Yeah, my favorite part, I just have to, another spoiler alert, when he's in the cage and all the smoke is there and they're trying to shock him and do whatever, and then you hear the rip, and then you look up and the cage is ripped open, and I was like, remember that? Roy liked that too. We were like, I was like, oh, that's when my heart started pumping. It was just like, it was all, because they were expecting him to come through the cage, but he went up through it and he ripped it all apart. You were like, and one more. I love this. When he was at that wall, and remember he's slashing the wall and he's just going nuts, slashing, and just the effects there. What do you think, Roy, seeing that?
No, it's just good. I've already sort of said, it's amazing. As my wife pointed out right away too, it starts off very slow for a modern movie. That's because it is an homage to the old movies. And she said she was worried that kids might click off before they ever got to it, because you're 10 minutes or so in before you see anything really monstrous. It's all just Scotsman with a big beard and a couple of people like that there, and this crazy plot. They're sending the great monster hunters out to hunt a monster in an enclosed space, but they have no weapons. I mean, it's a crazy concept, and so forth, the whole thing. But once you go along with it, it's no crazier than anything else that ever appeared in a comic book, I suppose, or in a lot of monster movies for that matter.
Yeah, I
didn't know, was it based on any other concept that anybody knows? I mean, that whole idea of the great monster hunters get together to hunt a monster. I didn't recognize.
I don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah.
And I like the Bloodstone. I don't know, Steve, you might remember from the Rampaging Hulk magazines. Remember Bloodstone? And now in the comics, his daughter is there, and it was an homage to that, because that's what they were looking for, the Bloodstone. Because I remember those from all the Rampaging Hulk magazines. So it's something to see, Steve. I think you'll enjoy it. It's like, it's a little slow, but then it goes. Then it and it wakes you up too. Yeah. Because it's like you're trying to figure out what's happening, and then it explodes. But
and then having that relationship that you see a little at the end between Man-Thing and the werewolf, that's really kind of nice. It's like Han Solo and Chewbacca. Except that if Han Solo could also turn into a little Chewbacca.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, it's whenever I'm selling any of the horror books, especially Werewolf by Night, it's definitely the strangest stories of the time. And I can't tell you how many mad monks or crazy religious people that popped up out of nowhere, these secret organizations of like these weird little flunkies. I mean, they were nowhere near Doctor Strange level magics. They were just like teetering around the edges, but still somehow having huge amounts of money, castles, and huge bases. And it's just a really weird little set of stories and it's only there. There's no shield, no one's coming in. They're existing, and Jack Russell is just going from town to town, meeting these weird. I mean, Dr. Glitter Knight. Oh my word! It's absolutely astounding. And I always tell people, especially collectors that are like, well, I'm not really into superheroes and stuff like. Well, I say, if you're not into superheroes, how about the weirdest stuff you're ever going to read? Okay, go and check out these Werewolf by Nights, because they really were completely different to anything that Spider-Man or Avengers or anything like that. It's
Yeah, Jerry really set the tone for that.
Yes, I don't know where Jerry. I don't know what Jerry was doing, but wow.
I never asked. I just let him go, and as long as the book was selling, it looked good, so forth. It read good, and and I had other things to do besides supervise Werewolf by Night. That just went along pretty well. Don Perlin came in and held it up fairly good. It lasted a reasonably long time, as these things go.
Yes. Now, if I remember correctly, of course you'll be able to correct me here, Roy. I think the last of the major monsters to come out in their own book, it was the Frankenstein book, right? From January 73.
Well, it came out after Dracula and Werewolf, anyway.
Yes, so I think it's the last.
We had a few others. There was, we had the Living Mummy and a few issues of Golem, but certainly Frankenstein was a little late. I don't know why. Stan decided it was okay. Once we had Dracula, and we had, if not the Wolfman, we had a werewolf. We even had Man-Wolf and Morbius. So he decided there should be, the Frankenstein monster, and everything. And that was no problem. I mean, again, being a fan of the old Dick Briefer Frankenstein and various other stories, I thought that was great. And I was really looking forward to adapting that novel, because I read that novel first when I was a teenager, and and loved it from the beginning. Same time I read Dracula for the first time, more or less. And but then I just got too busy, so I gave it to my friend Gary Friedrich, who did a really good adaptation for those 2 or 3 issues of the novel, and again with Michael Plug doing the hairy monster guy and so forth, and trying to find that way to keep it a little Karloffian, but not enough that that Universal was going to get on our back. That was always a problem that you didn't have with as much with Dracula and so forth. As actually, of course, we really should have gone whole hog and had a Frankenstein who was more Shelleyan. I mean, that was an 8. Okay, he was tall enough. That was an 8-foot gaunt, pale monster, and he wasn't a big Hulk like thing, and so forth. He might have been super strong, but he didn't look like Steve Austin or somebody, or Steve Houston. I mean, Steve Austin. That was the Bionic Man, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Steve Dallas. I don't remember which Steve. I don't know what it is. But anyway, we did, But I guess at that time, Stan felt it had to be a little. So we had different designs, and I think John Romita might have done the final design. I think and so forth that we set to Plug and so forth to get it a little Karloffian, but not too close. And no bolts in the neck, and the head doesn't have that same shape, but he still has that kind of look and so forth. And and it was a fairly popular series too.
You said 2 characters there that you co-created that not many people know about. First, number 1 is the Living Mummy. What's your and the other one is the Golem. Steve, you have to this. He kind of disappeared. Obviously, first let's talk about the Golem, and I know Steve will recognize this, where he first appeared, and then he eventually Len made it a little different. Can you talk about the Golem? Oh, I love that.
Yeah. Well, I get, you reminded me that I kind of forgot it, but I guess he appeared in a flashback or imaginary panel, in that Hulk story I did. I decided I was going to do a story where the Hulk became the Golem in some kind of European kingdom. I didn't emphasize the Jewish aspect of it, but it's obvious in there, but I didn't play that up so much. But so in order to do that, we had to have a couple of little feelings of what the monster was. So I guess the Golem kind of appears in there. And then later, I had Len Wein and with John Buscema, I think, did the penciling on a lot of that to do the series. And that didn't take off that much. We had that issue there. The funny thing is, as Jerry Conway discovered during the few weeks when he was editor-in-chief briefly at the beginning of 1976, and he went over the source. The Golem series, while it wasn't a big seller, actually sold much better than the early issues, most of the early issues of Warlock that followed it in the same title. Of course, Warlock over the years has become famous, has made a lot of money and going on, while Golem isn't. But it's just kind of, at the time, we were better off publishing Golem than we were Warlock. But Warlock, of course, was the superior.
And that's Jim Starlin's Warlock, just so you know.
Just not my Warlock or whatever. But
that's crazy.
You just never know. There's things that they don't sell well right away, but later on it turns out they have legs like Warlock.
And then people should know that, and I don't know if Steve does, but Steve, remember that issue of the Hulk, the Al Milgrom cover, and that big foot is like trying to crush the Hulk, and the Hulk is catching it. I don't know if you remember.
Yeah, issue 244, right?
Yes. That's the last appearance of the Golem. They made him really big in that, but the Hulk actually destroys the Golem in that, and he is overcome.
John, I think that's it, the Living Colossus.
Oh,
that was another monster. Yeah, the Living Colossus was.
I'm mixing up. Sorry.
Yeah. That was a funny story. Well, to me, I don't know anybody else. There has been that Colossus that was a Stan Lee Kirby character, right? Or I think it was Kirby rather than Ditko. Most of them were Kirby.
Yes.
And it was called the Colossus. But then I did that adaptation of the story by Theodore Sturgeon, that was probably the basis of the Heap and indirectly, therefore, of the Glob Swamp Thing. Whether Len Wein or Jerry Conway or anybody read those stories, particularly, it was still the basis of it by Sturgeon, written in 1940, and just a year or two before the Heap came along. And so Stan, we did an adaptation of it. Right. We call in supernatural thrillers, we called it just it. Stranko did the cover, and Maurice Severin did a wonderful job on the art inside. And Stan said, "Boy, I like that name, it." He had used it before too as one of those characters, but he says, "I like that. We got to use that as the name of a book." I said, "We can't do that. We don't have the rights to make a series out of it. Forget about the fact he was destroyed. I mean, we'd have to pay Ted Sturgeon, to do that." Well, Stan was about to, get into that. So he said, "Well, I don't care about that character. Just call it. I want something called it." So I dragged out this idea of the Colossus. It's an the Colossus. So we had different people, Tony Isabella and others wrote it. Dick Ayers drew it. So it wasn't a big success, but we had a few issues of that. But it was just an attempt to use the name "it" is all it was, and keep Stan happy. And the Living Mummy was it was just a mummy, so but you can't translate the Mummy, and also Universal has the Mummy, so I came up with the idea of the Living Mummy, and then gave it to Gerber. He was black, right? I think, which was kind of a nice touch, and everything. Yeah. And it didn't last too long, but Steve always wrote a wacky story, didn't he, Steve Gerber?
Oh, wow, it's just so crazy. Those stories would never be published today. Never be published today.
No, I'm not sure we should have published them then. It's thinking about sales, but
it's funny. We're forgetting, I think, right now. I know there's Werewolf by Night fans out there, but my favorite horror character of all time, okay, and it's close. Morbius is up there, but I want to talk about the Man-Wolf. I love the concept of the Man-Wolf and that moonstone.
What is the concept of the Man-Wolf?
Oh, and so I would love to get some background information on the origin of one of my favorites.
Yeah. Well, I don't remember too much about it, except I do remember that it was Stan who came up with the idea. We have Morbius and we have Dracula. So if we have werewolf, why not have a Man-Wolf? And I said, well, Stan, werewolf means Man-Wolf. He says, I don't care. Nobody knows that. So just make him Man-Wolf. So we came up with the idea, so it was basically Stan. Different people wrote it. I don't remember. Jerry probably wrote it because Jerry wrote everything. My only contribution was they were trying to figure out an origin at some point. And I guess I walked in and they said, and I came up with the idea. Says, well, he's J. Jonah Jameson's son. I think that might have been Stan's idea too. I said, he got his power from a moon rock. It's as ridiculous as anything else. If you're going to have a science fiction werewolf,
love that.
And they said, well, what's the scientific basis? I said, this is a comic book. Somebody else could say it shouldn't have been that, but I just felt, well, why not? And what do we know about moon rocks and what they cause? If you can believe that a werewolf is caused by a full moon, which is nothing but the sun reflecting off different aspects of the moon, you can believe that the moon rock could cause a Man-Wolf. It was later that they turned him to a sword and sorcery character, Dave Kraft and these people.
Oh, wow. Yes.
Do you like that stuff too, or just the early stuff?
You got David Anthony Kraft and George Perez, Star God. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger for me with the Man-Wolf. And but then I have no idea what a great touch that is. I mean, moon rock. I mean, he puts a little moon rock on, and suddenly, and also the fact that he was wearing his space uniform, and then he had the fur.
Now,
It was
Now-
a funny character
That's
combination
wrong.
of science fiction and werewolf. But Morbius was a combination of science fiction and vampirism. So this was the same, kind of thing. It was
Yeah.
just a different approach as opposed to the usual supernatural approach of Werewolf by Night. That's what we were trying to do, was to, if we're going to have to do a man wolf, we want to make him different enough from werewolf that it's not the same character. And I think it was probably Stan that came up with the idea that it be Jameson's son, who of course was an astronaut, and everything just flowed from there, including probably my idea of the moon rock. But as I said, I never wrote it. That was my only little contribution. But that was funny though. It was a funny concept. They should bring him back. He could be part of the Spider-Man universe now, couldn't he? Because he's
It
Jameson's
could,
son.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
again, I don't mean to be, a party pooper, but I don't think anyone working today can really write him.
No, Steve, I just have to say, any kid growing up in the late 70s fell in love with Man-Wolf because it was the Power record. I don't know if anybody remembered that. The Power records, that was that, and they had the mark of the Man-Wolf. And first off, the thing that got me was when Roy told me the moon rock, and I said, that was my favorite part of the werewolf. I love the fact that
It was
he
the
had,
silliest part.
and I don't know if you saw, I think that's issue 124 of the Amazing Spider-Man, if I'm
Yes,
correct.
indeed.
And the moon rock grafted itself to his skin. Remember that? And then
Yes.
Spider-Man had to rip it off.
But Jerry wrote that, right?
Yes, Jerry
Yeah,
wrote
I
that.
thought,
But
yeah,
when
the
Roy
first one.
told me he created the moon rock on him, I went bonkers because when I was a kid, Roy, I know it was nothing to you and it was just a thought. But for me, as a kid reading that was so incredible. Steve, this is where we connect.
That was in
again.
my
that moon rock.
That was in my job description. Make up silly ideas.
Oh God! But it's just like you, Steve. I did not like when he started getting all with the sword and all that. They totally went away.
No,
I wanted him just to be that creature that went crazy in the spacesuit. Fantastic. And with Ramita's drawing of the Man-Wolf was so good. Yes, Roy.
That was actually
Man-Wolf.
that was actually quite a bold move to give him his own feature in Creatures on the Loose. It's only
trying to sell
7
books.
issues, but very bold.
Nah, we just, we just flooded the market. We were trying to drive DC off the market. They had their good success with 3 or 4 books like, Witches Whatever and House of Mystery, and Joe Orlando and the people had a nice feel for that. We didn't really have we tried it. Stan came up with Tower Shadows earlier and then later the other things. But somehow, although Stan maybe could have done it, but the people we had working for us now, although a lot of them wrote stories earlier for House of Mystery, like Jerry and Marv and Len and those guys, they'd all worked in those magazines. But our whole orientation by then really was toward characters, and the whole idea of the 7 or 8 page story with a surprise shock ending. I mean, I like that very much, but it just wasn't us. We didn't have the time. It's just a waste. My God, spend all that effort on an 8-page story. Why can't you make a 20-page story about a real person and continue? It's, that was just our orientation. And Stan tried to, I remember a meeting where he had me and Archie Goodwin and probably Jerry, a couple people in there to give us the pep talk. But the problem was it just, it didn't work. Our hearts, maybe a couple of people here and there, but our hearts really weren't in that kind of thing. I think some interesting work was produced. Ralph Reese drew a few interesting stories in there and a few other things. And when they revived the second group, whatever that was, whatever the second round of those horror books was, I got Stan's permission to do some adaptations. So we did some Robert E. Howard, H.P. Lovecraft, and Robert Bloch and things like that. And that's when we did it, and Killdozer and things like that. But that it was just. But I think our hearts really weren't in that for the most part, and they all faded away. And what stayed and has still remained, even if they're not in their own books, is coming back, or Werewolf and Dracula and Man-Wolf and the characters like that.
Well, you guys,
I got to. Go ahead now. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, but you know what the difference is, because other publishers like DC and stuff, they were doing those horror comics, and they were horror stories, right? It just had those feel. But what Marvel was doing, what you guys were doing, Roy, what you were doing, you as fans of like superheroes and villains and all that stuff, you actually brought those horror characters still into that universe. So
Mhm.
it's like it was more exciting. It was more fun to like read these stories because they did kind of read like, you know, your Spider-Man and Fantastic Four, X-Men, things like that. And you know, I know, like you said, you guys know might not have really all had the huge passion for it, but I think the passion you guys did have with your other stories reflected in those. And it just made the werewolf more exciting. Dracula was more exciting.
Yeah.
Frankenstein. I mean, it was just a whole. You can still read them today. They're just so dynamic. They were
Yeah,
fun.
dynamic. They have that.
I
Yeah.
had a passion for that kind of character. I just didn't want to particularly write it. I mean, I wrote
Yeah.
a few Dracula stories for Dracula Lives and all that, but it just nowadays I would sort of like that. But at the time, I really wasn't interested in writing it. But luckily, I didn't have to. You
Yeah.
know, I just made up an idea, or it, you know, so other people. I don't. You know, it's weird. I either Stan or I, or together or separately, you usually would generate these ideas. But it wasn't because we only could have done it. It's just because we never asked anybody else to do it, you
Mhm.
know. And you know, I mean, you know, Jerry Conway or Len Wein, they could have walked in with a thing, and nobody ever said they couldn't, but they mostly, you know, didn't. And
Mhm.
I don't think it was because of the ownership thing as much as it was just the fact that I think they kind of thought Stan and I wanted to be the only people to do that. But you know,
Mhm.
we'd have been open to it. We just didn't ever think about asking them to, you know. So, but if
Yeah.
somebody, so people didn't start doing that until you began to have I don't know what Deathlock, and right at the end of my tenure there, a couple of people started to come up with things like that, you know. But mostly they just kept ours. Jim Starlin came in and he just took Warlock, and I allowed him to transform my version of Warlock into his version of Warlock, and that was fine, you know, and
Mhm.
things like that. But I just liked having those characters. I really loved having the Living Mummy and Werewolf and all of them. I just didn't care to write them.
Now I got a little story I never told Roy, and Steve, you're bringing it back with the man wolf. I got to go back, and I want to talk about the other golem too. But I got a quick story to tell you. When I was young, I fell for the man wolf, Mark of the Man Wolf, obviously from that Power record. And what I did, I don't know if you remember this, but you know, when you're young in that time, I was like 7 or 8, I would always be the Hulk. But when I saw those kryptonite rocks, remember they used to sell the kryptonite rocks? You could get them for like $3. It was like it might as well have been $1 million, but they were these glow in the dark rocks. When I begged my mother for one, $4 or $5 or whatever they cost, right? And when I opened it up, I tied a rope to, you know, like a whatever string to it, and obviously I did a horrible string, and I went outside with my underoos, and I was the man wolf with that with the kryptonite ball. But Steve, I was only, and now check this out. I'm telling this to Roy the first time. I was only the man wolf for a few minutes because I was playing over a sewer, like into the street.
Yeah.
And I didn't even tie it right, because how do you tie like a rope or whatever, like a string I had
Didn't
over?
have a hole in it, probably.
No,
Right,
no,
right.
because it was a glow in the dark, and I would
You
go.
too could kill Superman.
And what do you think happened to the rock? It
Oh,
went
you
right
jumped
right
down the
down.
sewer. Like I was over it. It devastated me. And you know, when you're a kid, and back then, you lose something, you never see it again, because in like your mom will not go to, especially my parents, they would never go, so it was gone. But I remember I went in the light in the bathroom to charge it up, and then I shut the light off, and then I had the thing, and I was like, rah, and
So if you got a little light on, it would glow. For
yeah,
a
and then it
while?
would glow in the dark,
Uh-huh.
and then I ran outside, rah, and it fell down the sewer, and I never saw it again. So that's how crazy I was with Moonrock. But I just wanted to tell you that story. Now,
I can't believe there are any Man Wolf fans in the entire
Oh.
world. I've never met one, let alone two
the
of them hosting the same show.
Moonrock, I was obsessed with the Moonrock because I never thought of that. It was just such a great concept. Okay,
Yes.
but I wanted to go back to the Golem, because you made another Golem that was in the
Invaders.
in the Invaders. Can you tell us
Well, that
about
was
that
just
one?
a throwaway, you know, since there had been Joe Kubert had drawn a story for some comics published by a Christian organization. It's called Challenger Comics, back in the middle of the near the end of the war, World War II, the big one. But and I had seen that it was basically a telling of the Golem story, the legend, but it was bringing the Golem to life in World War II to fight against the Nazis, protect the Jews. So I thought that, and just knowing about that story as an adult, I decided it'd be fun to take that concept, the idea of the Golem coming to life to fight the Nazis. So I just threw it into the Invaders, because in the Invaders everybody fought the Nazis. I intended him to be kind of the Invaders' Hulk, and if if things had gone a little differently, eventually he might have become a member of the Invaders or something, But we never did. The funny thing is, I think I I took my friend, a fan artist for Alter Ego, Bill Joe White, who was a fireman in Columbia, Missouri, and I named this soldier who's captured by the Nazis that star Bill Joe White. And he's captured, and as far as I remember, I never got around to actually freeing him. I think he's still over there in Berlin somewhere, a captive of some neo-Nazis or something. A little rough end in that story.
Yeah, no. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Steve.
Yeah, it's again, the Man Wolf is magnificent, but when it comes to the impact of what both companies were doing, obviously with DC, you have those single, 8-page stories, but the fan base are usually into the artists, and they'll be like, "Oh, there's an issue that's drawn by Neil Adams. There's an issue drawn by Bernie Wrightson. La la la, all great stuff." But when it comes to a lasting impact, I mean, take a look at the Tomb of Dracula, with Marv Wolfman, and Blade, and it went on all the way. It outlasted all the others. It went all the way until 1979. And basically, I don't know how you feel about it, Roy, but I think that the Tomb of Dracula is the finest version of Dracula that we will perhaps ever see. It's just a beautiful piece of work. Again, a character that was slightly on the outside of the Marvel universe, some tangential stuff there. But look at the impact of all of those characters compared to, the DC horror stuff.
Well, it's funny that the main thing that came out of what's the most famous thing that came out of all of the DC, and I'm not running them down. There was some good stuff in there with Neil Birdie, other people. But what's the most famous thing came out? Swamp Thing, which was a one-shot throwaway story, but it led nowhere. So they took it and made it into a character, became a big deal. But DC had to be kind of dragged, kicking and screaming, into making characters out of these things. They ended up with an eye vampire, and they had a spawn of Frankenstein. None of those worked. The only thing that really came out well was Swamp Thing. We had quite a few. I mean, maybe Swamp Thing was a little bigger than Man Thing, but we had quite a few of them. They lasted quite a number of years, and they're still around in one incarnation. Nicely to see two of them on, if not three, on TV the other night with probably a new and halfway and maybe decent this time Man Thing movie in the wings. So I'm kind of happy. It's kind of funny for a guy who never read horror comics in the 50s. I think I bought the first couple of issues of Adventures into the Unknown in 1948, as 7 or 8. They weren't really as horrific, but the EC stuff, when I would see that, I could tell it was well written because I could read. I could tell it was well drawn because I could see. But I also knew that if I read this stuff, I had a feeling it was going to disturb me a little. I don't mean, turn me into an expert. It was just going to give me nightmares, because that happened when I saw Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, one of my favorite movies. That was a scary movie to me. It was just as scary as the real Frankenstein movies. Actually, I saw it before I saw any of the other Universal horror films. And, so I just, liked the idea of doing the horror comics. I just took naturally to it. But partly is because that's what Stan wanted to do. I mean, Stan was if he wasn't behind every single character, he was the
Instigator.
He was the inspiration, for all the stuff. He's the guy that we were trying to please. And after a point, I knew what he wanted, which was Martin Goodman-like, to cover every single nook and cranny of horror. If there's a werewolf, there's 2 of them. If there's a vampire, there's at least 2 of them. There's a Frankenstein monster. There could also be a golem. We got to have a mummy because Universal had a mummy. Eventually, they had the Manphibian, I guess, briefly at least, because of the Creature from the Black Lagoon, when Bill Evans originally swiped at a 1950s Submariner story visually. And, it's I knew Stan kind of liked that. So between what he would suggest and what I would suggest, we ended up with a zillion books, just as many books as they probably had horror comics at Timely back in the 50s. But instead of there being filled with 4 or 5 or 6 4-page stories or 5-page stories with supposedly surprise ending, they were character stories. And the readers had a reason, if you liked it, you had a reason to come back the next month. I mean, you sort of did at EC or the other companies too. If you liked the kind of stories they told, you'd come back the next month to see what that artist would draw, what the new stories were. But if you liked the character, you had even more reason to come back, because you wanted to know what happened to Jack Russell. You wanted to know what was going to happen to the Frankenstein monster or Dracula or whoever. And that was our whole thing. And it worked, pretty well for us.
and the covers on all those Werewolf by Nights, and like when you saw that. Yeah, and Roy, you have a little hand in Blade. What did tell him what the name?
Yeah,
No, but I'm talking about the names.
Well, Blade, of course, is entirely Marv's inspiration and drawn by Colin. I wouldn't take anything. My only little contribution, which I was kind of pleased with, I didn't even think about 2 years, is that in the story, which of course was written before the cover was done, and I'm looking through it to find the cover scene. I'm working out with Gil Kane, penciled that cover, as he did so many of our covers for me because it was easy. And so I saw the thing, and he has this phrase in there, Blade the Vampire Killer, and I like that. But I said, for the cover, I said, I wrote that, and it didn't seem right to me. So I made up, Blade the Vampire Slayer, which I liked a little better. And and that's the closest thing I came to a contribution to Blade. And I'm kind of happy with that. But the real thing is, that was really, I guess Marv just made up this. He wasn't even working for Marvel at the time. He was still editing Warren's books for a short time, and I was trying to lure him into quitting, and he was kind of hanging on because it was a staff job and things, and finally it got to be too much for him and he came over. But I guess he was still actually working for Warren when he made up Blade, and but he made up such great characters. Rachel Van, I helped make up the early ones with Stan, because Stan and I talked over Tomb of Dracula #1, and then I ran home and wrote the first plot, but forgot to have Jerry put my name on when I had him dialoguing. But but after Frank Drake, all those characters, Rachel Van Helsing and Blade and a few other characters like that, so they were all, that was all Marv, and with Colin's wonderful drawing, it was one of the, I have a little liking for a thing called Conan the Barbarian, but I do think that Tomb of Dracula was one of the best sustained, along with Conan and a few other things, one of the best sustained performances in a Marvel series during the 70s, or probably most decades.
And Steve will agree with me here, and I'm sure Niall will too. It's those little things like Vampire Slayer, the Moon Rock. I know to you it doesn't seem anything, but sometimes those little things can make the whole so much more powerful. Like Man-Wolf would have been great. I love the name, and Stan came up with the name, but like I said, the Moon Rock drove me insane. It was so crazy. And then like even the
Crazy's
vampire,
the word,
I have a little saying. I think it's akin to the cherry on the icing. You have the icing, and Roy comes in, and that little cherry goes right on top.
It's amazing. Well, look,
I specialize in cherries. Somebody else has to make the whole ice cream.
Well, hey, let's do case in point to Thanos. Obviously, Jim Starlin's character, but he was this vampire-y type skinny character, and you told him to make him bulk him up and make him like Darkseid, and then it made him so much more imposing.
I like the look, but I love the name. Being aware of the, Thanos is, being death, and there's the poem Thanatopsis and all that, and and I thought, he's come up with a really good name here. Let's make him a really good, strong character. He became so strong that I'm practically disgusted with him. But he was, and of course that's all Jim. But people need guidance. Stan would guide me into doing something. I'd guide somebody else. It's still Jim Starlin does the most of the work, or Jerry Conway, and certainly Marv Wolf and these people.
I want to ask Steve a question, Steve, because he's a big Thanos guy. Just a really quick question. If Thanos was thin and wispy or big and strong like Darkseid, do you think he would have lasted or been as impactful if he didn't have that size and mass? Because he's from Titan. And Steve is the expert on Thanos. I want to hear his opinion.
Not a chance. Not a chance. When I first saw Thanos, he was dead. I saw a drawing of him in the official handbook of the Marvel Universe Book of the Dead. And I just remember thinking to myself, look at the size of this guy.
Yes.
Why is he dead? I hated it. I read the dialogue, and I was like, oh, I missed the 70s. Oh, no, I can't. Of course, I had to wait a little while. But no, his gravitas, his size is just overwhelming power. It means everything. That little adjustment to his character, that little advice means everything.
It does. It does.
At the time, I didn't know. It was just an idea,
Yeah, but Jesus,
Jim had to either do it or not do it,
And before I give it to Niall, I just want to do really quick. Son of Satan and his Santana. Can you? Obviously, they tried to make the Hulu tried to do a series that didn't work. But talk about perfect. Talk about the little history of these two.
The basic thing with that is that Stan came. I've said this before, but it's kind of funny to me. Stan, because Dracula was doing fairly well. I mean, Dracula was never like runaway super success, but had a good steady sales, and everything, and it doing real well. So at some point, Stan said, if we could make Dracula into a character, I said I'd like to do a book called The Mark of Satan, and I'm not a religious guy, so I didn't really care, but I said, Stan, you're asking for trouble. I said, there's certain people that are not going to like the idea, even if he's a villain, and he would have been a villain. But you might have to make him sympathetic, a la Milton or something. Better to be, king is hell than slave in heaven or whatever. And and there's going to be you're asking trouble. He says, okay, then come up with something else. So I said, how about the son of Satan? I said, you can do anything with the son of Satan. Nobody will care. What I didn't remember was that my friend Bill Joe White, the fan who was this fan artist back in the early 60s, he had actually done a 7 or 8 page story on, spirit duplicator. It wasn't even mimeograph, called Son of Satan, which was a little similar kind of character. It wasn't even ever copyrighted. I don't remember if I ever read it, but I did have the thing and I'd seen it. He had a trident, just like I said, I wanted Son of Satan. So I feel like in a way I maybe subconsciously stole that. I told Bill I was really sorry. If I thought of that, I wouldn't have suggested that name because I felt like I was stealing it, even though it was an obvious name. But Bill said, it was just one little thing. He says, Ed, I know you didn't steal it. So anyway, so that was okay. But then Stan had another thing. He said he wanted to have a character called Satana. It wasn't originally intended to necessarily be the son of Satan's sister or anything, but just satanic. He just wanted to get like it was a Vampirella kind of name. He wanted to make thought that would make a good name for a comic or something sometime, Satana, but he didn't have anything to write. He had no idea. So it's just character called Satana, do something with her. So what I'm going to do? I didn't have time to even assign it to anybody. He wanted something in print like right away. So I went into Ramita. Ramita is one of my favorite artists. Of course, he peaked with Captain America in the 50s, not Spider-Man, as far as I'm concerned. But still, Ramita was this great artist I had never had a chance to really work with. We worked together on covers. We worked together on all kinds of stuff, but we'd never done anything together. So I said, I got this idea for like a 3-page story, which is just her walking down the thing, and she's going to be attacked, ravaged or whatever by somebody, but he's picked the wrong person, and she ends up taking his soul, which is like a little butterfly. Just some little dumb idea I came up with in 5 minutes, and talked it over with John, and he went through it. So that's my only thing with John Romita, so forth. But of course, when they did Hellstrom, they took the L out of Hellstrom because it was hell, I guess, and they took Satana, they made her Anna because it was too comic book. And then in the Hulu series, when they were done, they had, of all the series that were done on Hulu and Netflix, I mean, that was the worst of them. I don't care what you say about Iron Fist. Hellstrom was, it was so dark. I was trying to watch it while on a treadmill in the daytime. I couldn't see what was going on. I'd have to stop the treadmill and sit down because it was so dark. I couldn't see what was going on the screen. It was all set at night, and it was just such an awful waste of a halfway decent character. I gave it to Gary Friedrich, my friend, who had, and he sort of introduced it through the Ghost Rider book and everything, so forth, which was another, actually, Ghost Rider is really in that same vein of the horror, in a way, almost semi-horror or semi-supernatural, but he wasn't supposed to be. The funny thing is, I didn't trace this back to later, but I realized as I traced it back that when Gary came up with the idea for a character called Ghost Rider, we'd already had the Western character, of course. When Gary came up with the idea of Ghost Rider as a villain for Daredevil, think about it. What kind of character would he have been? Would he have been supernatural? No. Daredevil never fought supernatural characters. He would have been a guy like Gary's earlier character, Helldiver. He might have had, or like the Ghost Rider Western, he might have made people think he was supernatural, but he wouldn't have really been supernatural. But once by accident, I said, without thinking about what it would be, I said the combination of the name and the idea of a motorcycle Ghost Rider was so good that before we didn't talk about anything, what it would be, supernatural, what he'd look like, anything. I said, this is just too good an idea to be in Daredevil as a villain or something. This should be its own book right away. Wow. So I took it into Stan, and Stan, who was a reasonably good editor before he was a reasonably good publisher,
Wow.
Within 2 minutes, he approved it. But then we started working on it. It's probably Stan, as much as anybody, who came up with the idea of it being supernatural. Somehow it very quickly evolved from this guy on a motorcycle into being a supernatural guy on a motorcycle. And as such, Gary's still the main, creator, with the Plug is the thing. But by the time Stan and I got done adding our little touches, it ended up being a character that Gary could take and make into, really one of the great success stories of 1970s Marvel. And of course,
That's awesome.
and then
Yeah.
so Son of Satan came, out of that in a way.
That
He wasn't as good a character, but how could he be?
just really quick before I give it to now, sorry now, but I just want to say that Marvel blender, like, I mean, seriously, between Roy and Stan, on top of the genius these other guys did, and how you guys just gave it, like Steve said, that cherry. Look, I know he's so humble and all that stuff, but would Marvel and these characters, especially during your tenure, I know he hates this, but I don't know if it would have reached the level it would have without even those things that you say are throwaways. It's just incredible. I don't know. It's just crazy.
I was very lucky because, I had all these guys, Jerry and Len and Marv, some of the, people who at DC or Marvel, Warren, whatever, were some of the best writers of character monsters and character superheroes, come waltzing in the door. And all I had to do was, point them at something or other, and they would go off and do it, give them 5 minutes of supervision, and then, watch them once in a while. And I was I was really lucky to have all these good, really good people come in. Steve Englehart, all these guys.
But when they rubbed off you and Stan, like how Kirby needed that, Ditko needed that, they had to have that rub, and they needed that rub with you. You had that, Roy. Okay, now go ahead. Don't deny it, Roy. You had that. Unbelievable. Go ahead, Niall. I'm sorry.
So I would like to know now. I know you kind of mentioned, a little bit about, not really wanting to, not really into writing this stuff or whatnot. Maybe be more interested now in doing some of that. So if a publisher came to you now and said, "Hey, Roy, we want to do a horror comic," what would you like to work on?
You think I'd tell you?
Yeah.
No, I mean, the problem is, I haven't really thought about it, so I don't know what it would be. But B, if I did think of it, I'd be a damn fool to say what it was, wouldn't I? Out loud. So I don't know if somebody came up with it after all the things I've done and all the things everybody's done, all the stuff that's been done over the last half century and more. It would be it'd be a lot harder now than it was in 1971 to come up. It was easy. You come up with Morbius. There'd been nothing quite like him before. Dracula had never had a comic book. There had never been a werewolf series, really. I mean, there was Werewolf Hunter in the Fiction House comic, but that wasn't even about werewolves most of the time. And, they really hadn't had Ghost Gallery and Fiction House. But, so it was easy then because there hadn't been that much before. Nowadays, with all the stuff that Marvel, eventually DC and other companies came up with, it would be kind of hard. I was just, being facetious about whether I'd tell you that. But I really don't have any ideas I'm sitting on like that. If somebody asked me to do it, I suppose I'd do it. I sort of like writing horror now. I adapted, the Dracula and Frankenstein movies, and I did some stuff for Topps with the Frankenstein Dracula War. I was kind of pleased with, and we did a biography of Vlad Dracula, the original historical character, except I turned him into a vampire at the end, just. And so I sort of enjoyed writing those comics, but that was when I was had turned like 60, 59 or 60 and so forth. And maybe it was just time. And I had felt a little differently because I felt, well, I'd done enough superheroes. It was time to do something else. But I don't know what I'd come up with. I'd try, but I'd make them pay me in advance just in case they didn't like the idea.
Go ahead, Steve. We're going to wrap up this Halloween. Good. You got some last words, last questions?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm mainly a superhero guy.
Me too.
But there is a cover that I rank up there with anything. And I'm going to be very intrigued to see if Mr. John Cimino can remember this cover. It's Giant Size Werewolf number 4. It's a red cover, like a red skylining, like a sewer. And you have the Werewolf by Night meeting Morbius. Morbius is flying through the air. And the werewolf is looking like this, like a beautiful.
Is it a Gil Kane cover? It sounds like a Gil Kane cover.
Yes.
And I remember I saw a picture of it when I was in England, and I was like, oh, I don't care what I do. I don't care what I have to do. I'm gonna get that book. And when it was one of the first books I bought when I came to the States, and it's truly majestic. It's truly magnificent. One of my favorite covers of all time.
Wow.
And again, for someone who was just superhero crazy, suddenly I'm into all these monsters. And so I would like to personally thank you for those little ideas, those little springboards. Of course we have Jerry Conway and Miles Wolfman and stuff like that. But such a magnificent, groundwork for classic material. It won't be done again. I don't think it can be matched. Those characters, they've only scratched the surface right now of the MCU and stuff that's going to go on. So we will see. And again, I really appreciate it, Roy.
I hope there is more Marvel horror. I mean, the Morbius movie, while I don't think it was as bad as some people do, but it really didn't quite pull together, even though Leto was excellent. But I gotta say, because of Morbius, it's Halloween. The thing that offended me from the beginning is the whole point of my character, Morbius, Mayan Gills, and to some extent Stan's character, was a guy who has this, tremendous guilt because he has to drink people's blood. He's not a real vampire. He's not an unfeeling undead. He's a real man, but he has to live. And should he live, and various things, and that kind of thing. And what did they do? They have him drinking synthetic blood all the way through the movie, so he doesn't have that moral qualm. They give the villain, the real awful blood drinking, and make him the villain. And they have this cop out for Morbius by having him drink synthetic blood. And there's a theory that he might run out and have to do it, but that's not the same thing. Maybe he did once at the beginning, but I think I wanted to see him be the person who was tortured by the fact of what he had to do and be fighting that off all the time. And while he's got this red stuff, he can just guzzle. I'll run out eventually. But meanwhile, it took everything out of it. And I think forgetting about all the stuff of the fact he didn't have a fully developed plot and this and that, and any other faults it may have had, I think they destroyed the character at the beginning because they didn't understand the character.
Yeah. And to talk about what Steve was saying about that cover, obviously, Gil Kane was on fire with those covers during the 70s. Because Steve, this is where me and you can exchange our eyeballs, because I saw what you saw and you saw what I saw. When I saw those covers, like on the Defenders and everything, like when Gil Kane.
Do you know who inked that cover, Steve?
I don't know who inked it.
No, I'm just wondering because a lot of them were inked by Tom Palmer, and Gil would pencil, but he didn't have a lot of blacks. But when you had if Frank Cicoria on a really good day,
and Ramita,
he could do that.
Oh.
Sinnott was not a horror inker, but he could do it. But when you had Tom Palmer do a bunch of them, or Ralph Reese might come on and do something or other, Frank Brenner inked a Conan cover by Gil. When you had Gil and those designs and inked by the right person, you had a really nice team.
Thought Gil Kane's pencils with Ramita inks were some of the greatest, some of the greatest drawings I could ever hope for. That was one of my dream teams. You saw him on Spider-Man, and you saw a lot of those on the cover with was incredible. But now in ending, we're wrapping up this Halloween. We have to throw out the Rutland, Vermont parade, obviously, but something that, but I want to give the modest guy over here some credit. Obviously,
you haven't given me enough credit. I mean, I've been blushing. You can't see it.
I have to, but you're the guy that started the trend of all the other guys starting to do it every year. You were the first guy with, the guy who played Batman, and then he did the
Tom Fagan.
Yeah, Tom Fagan.
Yeah.
But you were the first comic creator guy to go up there.
It's Dave Kaler and I were the first two. Dave had just started working because I had some assignments from Charlton to do some stuff. So I had sent him over. He had done a couple of things and got into doing Captain Action for Charlotte. And so we were a couple of comic pros. We met Tom Fagan at the 1965 comics convention in that building that was about to fall down there, and did fall down a few years later. And he invited us to come up for Halloween. So we went up. Dave had his Doctor Strange costume, which was nice. I had the Plastic Man costume my aunt had made for me. And he was Batman, and that was about it for characters in that parade. But a year or two later,
isn't that cool? So cool.
Other people started coming up. I did a second story, and that same year, and of course it got all the attention, but they both came out at the same time and so forth. Denny and Neil did the first DC one, which was that Batman story, which was the Nazis and everything. And I did one in the Defenders at the same time. And then I decided, I'd had 2 stories. I had put Genie and me in both of them. I was done. What I didn't know was I had unleashed this monstrosity. My 2 little photographs of me and Genie in there. The next thing we had Steve Englehart and Jerry Conway and Len Wein and their girlfriends all roaming around in a story that went back and forth between DC and Marvel Comics for 3 or 4 different comics. And it was kind of funny and kind of fun for a while.
This is what our podcast is about now. Block your ears. This is why Steve and Niall and me do this, is that we give the adulation to the legends. But Roy, I know you hate to hear this, but you're the legend of legends of legends because because you started these trends. No, of course, but being a fanboy, and understanding that, like, Stan wasn't going up to go putting on costumes and doing that. Kirby wasn't either.
He could have. They'd have paid him enough.
But I'm just saying, it's like, that's why I love this and why we do this, is because we have to, if Roy's not going to say it, we got to twist his arm and make him say it and tell him how it affected us, because obviously how it affected Steve, how it affected Niall,
if I hadn't done
millions of kids.
If I had not done that, there would not be a guy sitting there with a long black wig and another guy with teeth coming out of his nose. I thank you very much for being the influence on some of that.
Okay, Niall, last words now?
No, I mean, it was just, this is great. I just love hearing these stories and all this stuff of working on these characters, developing them. And man, I just always enjoy talking with you, Roy. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry because I'm the interviewee, you sort of get it, my side of things. But I want to stress that, if I did one thing for this character, I sure don't want to take away from all the people who did all the hard work.
No, and we understand that. We just like hearing
work than just making up the idea, because that's just the beginning. After that, that's like
Steve,
a one-night stand. They're the guys that had to raise the
Steve
kids.
said it best. Yeah. You're like the cherry on top that just made it that much. But that cherry on top, despite what you think, made it so much better. Don't listen to Roy. Don't listen. We don't listen to. So, Steve, get us out of here with some last words.
You know what? It's been a fantastic show. We've all learned something today. I mean, I had no idea that you were responsible for that little touch on the man-wolf. And those little gems of information, that first-hand information, as far as I know, I think that's the first time it's ever been revealed. And again, I just love this show's concept, so I love it. Boom.
Boom.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on Pop XP. If you haven't already, make sure to click that subscribe button and also click the bell for notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content. Also, don't forget to head on over to Twitter and follow us at the Pop XP and over on Instagram at the Pop XP. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you soon.